Joshua chapter 8, after talking about some of the moral and ethical questions around the conquest, we got back to it in looking at the differences in the comparing and contrasting the Battle of Jericho to the first time of Ai and the second time of the Battle of Ai. And just how when they returned to Ai, this time God was directing the battle, and this time it ended in victory instead of defeat. Now, there were some consequences after the Battle of Ai, after that victory. The way was now clear for the Israelites to go to Mount Ebal. They're in the middle of Canaan. They can now go out up to the mount. And we looked at the commandment in Deuteronomy 27 where God commanded through Moses that they go up to the mountain and there declare the curses of the law. And we briefly also looked at the last curse given in Deuteronomy 27:26. Curse being anyone who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them, and all the people shall say amen. So it was a congregational call and response. And we were reminded that this verse was also referenced by Paul in his letter to the Galatians when he contrasted it to living by faith. Instead, the law was a law that you lived by, your righteousness was by living according to the law. So half the tribes were to stand on Mount Gerizim. This was the Mount of Blessings, and half on Mount Ebal. That's the Mount of Curses, while the Israelites in the ark stood between the two halves of Israel and announced the curses of the law. And Joshua read the whole law to the people in this natural amphitheater that was created between the mountains. And I should also note that Mount Ebal was excavated pretty recently, in the late 1980s, early 90s. There was a structure found there that may be this altar that Joshua set up, although like with many things, that claim is disputed. But it's an interesting site of excavation nonetheless. And it was also pointed out to me that there was some recent news that they might have found some tablets, like a little curse tablet on Mount Ebal as well. Again, it's all disputed, but that doesn't surprise me in the least bit. So we imagine the scene, right? The Israelites are renewing the covenant. They're saying the last amen together. And then suddenly we get into chapter 9 and we shift on over to the city of Gibeon. And you got the Hivites there and they're meeting together and they're basically saying, what are we going to do? We got a big problem here. The Israelites are here and they're going to wreck us if we don't do something, basically. So they devise a plan to pretend to be from far away so that they can make a covenant with Israel. We discussed how the Gibeonites, they're all warriors, but they decided that they couldn't defeat God and the Israelites, and instead that they needed to make peace with them. And we looked at this verse from chapter 9, verse 24. When their deception was found out, here's how they answered back to Joshua. They answered Joshua, because it was told to your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. So they know this for a certainty that this is what's going to happen. You could see that they have a faith. It's making them afraid of, for their lives. And they decide to do something about it. And instead of many of the Canaanites, they're going to try to make peace with Israel. They make peace with Israel. And maybe we made a little bit of a parallel as well, that it's a good thing to make peace with God while you still can. And we can do that today through Jesus Christ. So after making a rash vow with the Gibeonites, Joshua and the Israelites are quickly called upon to honor this covenant commitment as 5 kings gather together to make war against the Gibeonites. So God honors the covenant with the Gibeonites, and he fights for Israel in a remarkable fashion. First of all, he sends large hailstones that kill more than the Israelite soldiers. This is in chapter 10 now. Coincidentally, in the past couple of weeks, there was a devastating hailstorm. I don't know if you heard about this, over in Oregon, in Wallowa County. I think they've seen like baseball-sized hail. And I've seen some of the pictures, just smashed windows, dented cars, and I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be on the receiving end of such a hailstorm. It would have just been devastating. So God did one other thing. At the request of Joshua, he made the sun and the moon stand still and prolong the day, presumably so that battle could be finished. And here's the verse that we called out as well. And the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. And I like how Clint called this out as well. Here's the remarkable part. There has never been a day like it before or since. Why? Not because of the sun or the moon, but when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So after the battle, the 5 kings are killed, and Joshua reassures his leaders that kings are no match for the Lord. We're going to see that tonight a lot. Okay, so tonight, we're calling this week's lesson Conquest, which is kind of repetitive. But if this was like a TV show, this week could feature some pretty epic battle montages, maybe even a clip show, so we could get like 2 cinematic cliches in one. Rereading these chapters, though, I was really surprised by a number of interesting nuggets in these chapters. So even, montages have some good moments too. We're going to be covering a lot of ground tonight, both textually and physically, as we're going to go through the last half of chapter 10 and then through to the beginning of chapter 14. So let's get into it. At the end of chapter 10, verses 29 through 42 is where we're going to be starting. So as we said last week, after the Battle of Ai, Israel had secured a foothold in central Canaan, and their base camp is at Gilgal. You'll see that that's where they're going to return to. At the end of the chapter, they came back to Gilgal. This was the same camp that they had used before the Battle of Jericho. Okay. So after defeating the 5 kings and making peace with the Gibeonites, central Canaan is now fairly well secured. And now the Canaanites are going to launch a conquest throughout Canaan, and they're going to start with southern Canaan. So let's take a look at kind of the path taken here, and I'll put it up on the screen as well. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read these verses, but I will call out a couple of things. There's a number of cities that are taken in these battles, Makkedah, Libnah, but I'll also call out that at Lachish in verse 32 and in Eglon, there were, it's interesting that it says that they laid siege against these towns, but these are very short-lived sieges. Lachish, they captured it in the second day. Verse 34, with Eglon, they captured it on the same day. So this wasn't, again, God is fighting for Israel, even when it's entrenched. It's not entrenched for very long. And then they moved on to Hebron and Debir. Let's take a look at verses 40 through 43, because this kind of summarizes the southern campaign. So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country and the Negeb, and the lowland and the slopes and all their kings. He left none remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord God of Israel commanded. And Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen as far as Gibeon. And Joshua captured all these kings in their land at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. So a couple of things in this passage that are kind of common themes throughout the book as well. Devoted to destruction again. We discussed that, and time permitting, at some point we can discuss it some more, but that means everything was everything that lived was wiped out. It was kind of like a reformatting of the area. I think in computer think, right? They just kind of reformat it. The Lord fought for Israel. That's a common theme. Verse 40, it calls out the Negeb. Some of your Bibles will have a V instead, the Negev. It's the southland or the dry land. And authors here also call it the hill country, which hopefully in the next couple of weeks we can call out some more of the geography and get into that. And then at the end, back to the base camp at Gilgal. Okay, so on to the northern conquest, all right? So I want to read a little bit of this, but now the battle will shift to the north. The king of Hazor, he's going to gather everyone he can into this epic battle. And I want to call out quickly Hazor. It's kind of near the top of the arrow there, north of the Sea of Galilee. It may have actually been the largest city in all of Canaan at this time. There are some estimates that the population of the city was at 20,000, which for the time was remarkable and larger even than Jericho. So there's been a lot of excavations at Hazor recently as well, and it was a major town in northern Canaan. All right, let's jump into it. Chapter 11, verse 1. When Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent to Jobab, king of Medan, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Akshapha, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country, and in the Arabah south of Chinnereth, and in the lowland, and in Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites. Those, remember, that's also the Gibeonites were Hivites, but these are not Gibeonites, under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. Verse 4, and they came out with all their troops, a great horde, in number like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And all these kings joined their forces and came into camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Verse 6, and the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against them by the waters of Merom and fell upon them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as Great Sidon and Meriphoth Maim, and eastward as far as the valley of Mizpeh. And they struck them until he left none remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord commanded to him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Okay. And here's again a detailed map about where we think this engagement might have taken place, might have looked like. And it might be kind of hard to see, but you'll notice a number of these places on the map have question marks next to them. This has been part of the fun of researching these locations. We think it was over here or over there. A lot of these they haven't entirely pinned down. I want to also call out, back to verse 7. It says, Joshua and all of his warriors came suddenly against them. This seems very similar to what happened in chapter 10. If you look at chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, it's a similar cadence. The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you. This is Joshua 10:9. So Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched up all night from Gilgal. So there's a common pattern at least twice here that there's no hesitancy from the Israelites. God reassures Joshua, and you kind of detect from the verses, I do at least, a let's go mentality. They just get on it, and they launch into battle suddenly, which I think also speaks to the confidence they have in God at this point. All right, so summarizing the next few verses, the Israelites capture Hazor. They kill its king, Jabin. I thought it was interesting. God's going to use another king, Jabin of Hazor, against the Israelites in Judges 4, if you remember about Deborah and Barak as well. But I think that's a different one because it says here that he doesn't make it. The Israelites burn a number of the cities in northern Canaan. It's interesting in verse 13 it says that he didn't. None of the cities on the mounds did Israel burn. Remember, some of these cities have been built up layer upon layer. They're also called tells, like Jericho was a tell. So those cities are not being burned, and perhaps that is just to use them as places of settlements. Okay, and then let's get down to verse 15 though, and we'll put it up on the screen. Read it together. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Talks about the fact that God gave vineyards that
Right. Yeah, that certainly could be what's going on because he says that about verse 14, all the spoils of these cities and these livestock the people of Israel took for their plunder. And that would make sense. And yeah, you're thinking of Deuteronomy 6, right? The good cities, houses full of things you did not fill. So yeah, maybe not a scorched earth policy. Larry, I feel like I should run you a mic.
They haven't had manna or quail for months now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. But that was by the time I got over here. All right. Larry points out they hadn't had manna or quail for months now, so yeah, a scorched earth policy might not have been the best course of action at this point. Yeah, it's a good call out. Okay, verse 15. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So we see here a very clear, again, line of succession, but chain of command, right? God commanded Moses. Moses commanded Joshua. Joshua did it. He left nothing undone that was commanded of him. So this is a great verse, again, that speaks to Joshua's faithfulness. As we pointed out, Joshua, he wasn't perfect, but he was faithful, and especially faithful in the things that were that God told him to do. God told him to do something, he would do it. It was when he didn't consult God that maybe things didn't go as planned. Okay, let's take a look at verses 16 through 20. So Joshua took all, this is back in chapter 11. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country and all the Negev, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, as far as Baal-Gad, in the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all these kings. Verse 19, there was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle. Verse 20, for it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction and should receive no mercy but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. So verses 16 and 17 describe the breadth of the conquest at this point. It is interesting to call it the land of Goshen. That's obviously not, down in Egypt where the Israelites were. It's a different area that perhaps could be to the west. The Arabah is usually to the east. Mount Halak is thought to be in the south, and Mount Hermon is up in the north. So it's kind of describing some cardinal positions here. And like a good montage, there's a lot of time passing here as well. And it doesn't give an exact time frame, but it says that he made war for a long time. In verse 20, again, we've highlighted on the screen here, it's also fascinating, saying that God hardened the hearts of the Canaanites so that they would fight. Obviously, right off the bat, we think about Pharaoh, right? God hardens Pharaoh's heart. But if we look back at the book of Exodus, we see that Pharaoh hardened his heart a couple of times before God started doing it for him. I'm also reminded of 1 Timothy 4:2 when Paul is talking about liars who have a seared conscience. From the atrocities in Canaan that we were talking about, this also seems to describe the Canaanites as well. Or we could think of what Paul would say in Romans chapter 1 when he talks about God giving people up to the lust of their hearts, to the debased mind. So God is using this hardness of heart to carry out this judgment as well. But it is interesting to note again, the Hivites of Gibeon, they were also called out here again, and perhaps maybe this suggests that their hearts weren't totally gone at this point, that they weren't as hard-hearted. They were certainly able to humble themselves before the Lord and the invading Israelites. Okay, a couple more verses. Spending a bit more time at the latter half or a bit more time in chapter 11, because there's some really neat things in here. Let's go to verse 21. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel, according to their tribal allotments. So Joshua takes out the Anakim. These are the descendants of Anak. These are the people that the spies were afraid of in Numbers chapter 13. Remember, they said that we looked like grasshoppers in their eyes. In turn, the sons of Anak are mentioned in Numbers 13 as the sons of the Nephilim, which I think that goes back to Genesis 6, the mighty men of old, the men of renown, which that's also kind of confusing to me because that's before the flood, so I don't know which one of the people on the ark is descended from the Nephilim, but oh well, I won't get into that. Either way, these are assumed to be big guys or giants, right? It is interesting to note, they call out 3 cities here, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, where some remained. I think it's going to come up later, right? Who was from Gath? It was Goliath, of course, right? So they didn't complete the conquest. It's going to be a thorn in their side later on. It's going to be an issue. But even in that, an opportunity as well for God's might to be displayed through David. So kind of neat. And then at the end of verse 23, this great transitionary statement, and the land had rest from war. What a transition, too. It just kind of makes a clear delineation in the text. So after this point, we're going to start looking at a recap of the conquest and then the allotment of the lands to the tribes. So first of all, Before we can do that, though, we're suddenly whisked away to another time and place. And this is years earlier, and the Israelites, they're grumbling in the wilderness again. Big surprise there. Seems like what they did in the wilderness. And they've been traveling for 40 years, and the Promised Land is nearing. They can almost taste it. Well, what they are tasting, they're tired of. They're tired of manna. They now call it that worthless food. Interesting that we were just talking about manna a little bit ago. So they're close to the Promised Land, but the Edomites won't allow them to pass through their territory. And God is not rendering judgment on the descendants of Esau. They're not part of the plan in the conquest. In fact, God is actually, at this point, he's passing judgment on the people of Israel for their grumbling. And he sends snakes among the people, and in a scene that Jesus will refer to later, he has Moses set up a bronze snake for the people to look on them and be saved. And it's in this setting that we find the Israelites in Numbers chapter 21. Let's take a look there. So the Israelites, they're tired, they're grumbling again, and they've just lost many of their numbers to snakes sent by God. But it's in this setting that they will suddenly have success. It's in this setting that they will launch into the conquest east of the Jordan, starting in verse 21 of Numbers 21. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, "Let me pass through your land. We will not turn aside into field or vineyard. We will not drink the water of a well. We will go by the king's highway until we have passed through your territory." But Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his territory. He gathered all of his people together and went out against Israel to the wilderness and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. And Israel defeated him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, as far as to the Ammonites, for the border of the Ammonites was strong. And Israel took all these cities, and Israel settled in all the cities of the Amorites in Heshbon and in all its villages. For Heshbon was the city of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and taken all of his land out of his hand, as far as the Arnon. And then there's a ballad about that as well. So the Israelites, they asked to pass through the land of the Amorites. This is also interesting to me because in Deuteronomy 7, God says that they will possess the land of the Amorites here. So I think in this case, this is another example of God accomplishing his will by hardening Sihon's heart. And we actually see this in Moses' recounting of this in Deuteronomy chapter 2, and I'll put this up on the screen. But Sihon, this is Moses speaking, but Sihon, king of Heshbon, refused to let us pass through. For the Lord your God had made his spirit stubborn and his heart obstinate in order to give him into your hands, as he has now done. So it's interesting thinking about that verse in Joshua and seeing how that was in effect even east of the Jordan, this hardening of the people's hearts. So the Israelites under Moses' leadership, they defeat the Amorites. They start settling in all their cities. Again, you get the impression that the Israelites, they're ready to be done with wandering at this point. We're not going to read verses 31 through 35 of Numbers 21, but it's a similar story to the north of the Amorites when Moses and Israel defeats Og, king of Bashan. It is interesting to note, though, in Deuteronomy chapter 3, Moses calls out that he had a really cool bed. It was like this big bed of iron. It's like the one, bed that's called out in the Bible. So these victories are what are recounted in Joshua chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. And I'll call out verse 6 of Joshua 12. We'll get back to Joshua now. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave their land for possession to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And as you can see up here on the screen, we're talking again about east of the Jordan River, which runs right here. And it is also interesting to point out these territories, unlike a lot of the territories west of the Jordan, these territories are controlled by a king that controls larger lands, Sihon and Og. It was multiple cities. When we, in a second here, talk about west of the Jordan, it's going to be a different story. Okay, so in verses 1 through 6 of Joshua 12 talk about these two kings defeated under Moses' leadership. Verses 7 through 24 are going to list all the kings west of the Jordan that Joshua and the Israelites defeat. And just listing them out on the screen, you can see there's a lot of them. They're summarized at the end of verse 24. It's 31 kings in all. And this is again because west of the Jordan we have city-states. They are individual. They each have their king. Remember, with Gibeon, it was called out as one of these cities like one of the royal ones, but they didn't themselves have a king. It's probably a good thing for them because it didn't work out too well for cities with kings. So that's a lot of kings. Important cities had kings, and we would also see a pattern here that Israel is going to look at that and say we want one of those too later on, of course, right? If we fast forward to the time of 1 Samuel. But as pointed out in 1 Samuel chapter 8, God was supposed to be Israel's king. Okay, so we're quickly coming to chapter 13, and we're going to take a look at a couple of the verses at the beginning of chapter 13. I guess I take issue with the monk that invented the verse boundaries here because I'm doing this whole like A-B split the verse thing. Verses 1 through 2a. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess. This is the land that yet remains." And they detail some of that. And then down to, actually God details that, right? And then down to the end of verse 6. "I myself," this is God speaking, "will drive them out from before the people of Israel. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance as I have commanded you. Now therefore divide this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes and the other half of the tribe of Manasseh." Okay, so there's still a number of lands possessed. God is ready for them to divide the land now. It is also interesting in chapter 14, and we'll look at this next week, Caleb is now, he says he's now 85 years old. There's no reason to believe that Joshua isn't anything but in the same neighborhood, plus or minus 5 to 10 years, so he could be 80 to 90. And I don't really know how this necessarily works for Joshua and Caleb. They still seem like they have plenty of strength. I kind of think Lord of the Rings, it was like one of the Dunedain, right? Is blessed with long life. But he's able to carry on pretty well. But it's also after what we saw in chapter 11, they had been at war for a long time. And I can again imagine the Israelites, just like in the end of Numbers, they're probably getting ready they want to settle down a bit. So God had established the boundaries of the conquest in Numbers chapter 34. Here's a map to summarize that entire chapter, what that looks like. And again, it's interesting. We were talking a couple weeks ago about how Deuteronomy kind of lays the design, the blueprint for Joshua. So does a lot of what's in Numbers as well, and I'm gaining an appreciation of that. So with where we're at the beginning of chapter 13, this is my own rough sketch overlay of what I think the land to be conquered still looks like. There's some land down to the south. There's obviously the coast where the Philistines are. And then there's a lot of land up north. And you'll see up north in the map as well, in the boundaries given in Numbers 34, it goes all the way up to Lebo Hamath, Zedad, Mount Hor. If those locations are well known, Tyre and Sidon were supposed to be part of Israel's territory as well. And to the best of my knowledge, that never happened, even though they had some friendly working relations and trades with Tyre and Sidon, right? The cedars of Lebanon used in the temple. Those territories would never become part of Israel. So I kind of asked myself, what's going on here? Are the Israelites settling for good enough? Is God just settling for good enough? A couple of thoughts, and I'll open it up for some questions and thoughts as well. But it seems like it's time to pass the baton on to the next generation, right? I mean, that's why else call out that Joshua is old and advanced in years. It's time for another leader to step up. And so it's acceptable at this point to begin settling. I guess when you talk about the boundaries set forth in Numbers 34, there wasn't a mandate that this had to be done during Joshua's lifetime. It's an interesting thought if that's what God's intent was. Time remaining in this quarter, we're going to look at the beginning of Judges 2, just because it also wraps it up a bit. And I know you spent some time in Judges as well, right?
There are verses in Judges that God had long
Okay. Okay, yeah. I was looking at some of those early chapters in Joshua, and I was noticing some differences there. Adam points out that at the beginning of Judges, it points out that it was supposed to be a long conquest. Okay. But even then, we're going to see and maybe I know we've already looked at this in classes on Judges, that it's never going to reach its fullest potential. And I think again, it's I don't know, it comes off as kind of a sadness to me. It's a bit of a bummer when God has these great plans that, people don't fully realize, and they kind of get in their own way on that. Let's see, other thoughts on that. I really breezed through those chapters very quickly. Okay, so the next several chapters 13 through 21, are going to deal with the allotment of the land. And the rest of chapter 13 details the lands east of the Jordan and what was given to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe Manasseh. And the beginning of chapter 14 introduces the lands that are divided up west of the Jordan. And so next week, what I'd like to get into then is, we're going to call next week's lesson, A Man with a Different Spirit. Okay, so I do have a little bit of bonus coverage because I was wondering if I was going to, so much material, I was wondering if I was going to go through it too fast. Couple of things to call out too. I didn't want to entirely skip over this, but I also see it as kind of like a footnote in Joshua. Let's take a look at chapter 13, verse 22. This is what Jake Collins called out a couple weeks ago. Talking about some of the battles east of the Jordan. It says in verse 22, Balaam also, the son of Beor, the one who practiced divination, was killed with the sword by the people of Israel among the rest of the slain. So I was debating if I wanted to really get into that. Jake says he's got a 4-part series on Balaam. Maybe we'll make him get into it at some point. But I did review some of the text around it, and it is fascinating. Balaam's death is called out in Numbers chapter 31, verse 8 as well. And it's certainly a good one to review. What was interesting that I hadn't recalled until, and Jake pointed it out to me in class, was in Numbers 31, in verse 16, when they're talking about intermarriage. Moses says, Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident at Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. And that was, given to Numbers chapter 25, where they started worshiping, they started getting into Baal worship at Peor. So Jake pointed out correctly that part of Balaam's plan was actually intermarriage here, it seems, or part of the advice given by Balaam. So anyway, it's called out, and he's an interesting enough person to be called out also in Joshua in the recounting of what happened east of the Jordan. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Deuteronomy 7, the Lord your God will drive out nations. Not
Mm-hmm.
allowed to let people all at once for the wild animals.
Right. Right.
Talk about like
Right.
inheritance. More than just tribes, it's also as the tribes grow. Take over more land over time.
Mm-hmm.
For everybody all at once.
The lands.
Vineyard, olive orchard.
Yep. Yeah. Excellent call out. Yeah. Adam calls out Deuteronomy chapter 7 about the where in verse 22 the Lord is going to drive them out little by little, and it does give Israel room to grow, and it also gives the land time to recover and accept this time. Yep. Okay, one other thing that I wanted to cover several weeks ago and didn't really get to is this phrase devoted to destruction. It's a common phrase that comes up in Joshua. When I searched through it, the ESV has it 17 times in the book of Joshua. And it's interesting to look at other renderings of this phrase. The King James has accursed to the Lord. The New King James has doomed by the Lord to destruction. The New Living has completely destroyed as an offering to the Lord. And the CSB has set apart to the Lord for destruction. Now, there's a couple of Hebrew words here that I was kind of digging into a little bit. That's sherem, and then there's also haram. One's a derivative of the other. And I wouldn't pretend to know Hebrew, because I don't, obviously. But what's interesting is you can look at like how the word's used in the Bible. And sherem also has a connotation of a net or a closing in net, either literally or metaphorically. And I'm reminded of the parable of the net in Matthew chapter 13. I'll take a quick look there as we've got another minute. So Matthew chapter 13. In verse 47, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I guess this parable came to mind because, again, it's a scene of judgment and of separation. And just thought it was interesting, speaking of a net. And then I'll call out Exodus chapter 22. This phrase also shows up here. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Any thoughts on that phrase? I wanted to make sure I came back to it, and we had a couple extra minutes tonight. Okay, all right, so next week we're going to get into the man with a different spirit. So thank you all again for your time and attention. You're welcome.